Hi,
Hi, Pawan. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Hi, Dr. Samir. Nice to meet you.
Pleasure. Same here.
Hi Pawan,
Hi, Sachin.
to connect.
Great.
So we're just checking the sound and video.
Okay.
We've also done a live also,
Okay.
just to check if it is you know coming fine. We're just checking the sound and video.
Please let me know when to start streaming, sir.
Sachin, I think you're on mute.
Oh, you can start streaming because you have to check if the sound quality is there, Neeraj. I've checked my YouTube channel, B.PAC. It's working fine.
So I've told Kshitij to start streaming. Kshitij, start.
Okay.
So Neeraj, just let us know once the streaming is fine on St. Joseph College YouTube channel.
Yes, sir. 1
We
second.
have another 2 to 3 minutes.
Is my voice fine?
Yeah, it's very good. Yeah, sounds it's clear. Wait. Yeah, I think it's 4 o'clock. We can start.
A very warm good evening to everyone present here. On behalf of B.PAC and the Department of Economics at St. Joseph's College, Bangalore, the Economics Forum, and Oeconomica, I welcome you to this webinar on the Union Budget 2021 and Urban Planning by Dr. Samir Kagalkar and Mr. Pavan Srinath. I'm Verona Jivika, and the duty vested in me this evening is to be your MC. Kindly note that you have to keep your microphones on mute and your cameras turned off to avoid any disturbances. Please avoid greeting each other or introducing each other on the chat box. However, if you have any questions, please feel free to leave them on the chat box, or if you're joining us from YouTube, you can use the live chat box option. Kindly refrain from asking questions about the same during the talk. The feedback forms will be available only once the talk ends. I take this opportunity to welcome our speakers for the evening. Mr. Sameer Kagalkar, and Mr. Pavan Srinath. Our esteemed faculty, the organizing committee, as well as students and faculty joining us from universities all over India, like St. Joseph's College, Bangalore, Mount Carmel College, Bangalore, Christ University, Jyotinivas College, Symbiosis College of Economics, Indian Maritime University, Kochi, and the various other universities. I hope we all have a wonderful session this evening and we have something to take back from it. I now invite Mr. Sachin, the Manager of Communications at B.PAC, to talk. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Verona. I welcome all the audience. I welcome the speakers, Dr. Sameer Kagalkar and Pavan Srinath, for giving away so much time for this interesting discussion. And I would also want to talk about BPAC a little bit. I'm sure many of you know about BPAC, the work that we're doing, especially with respect to good governance practices and trying to bring in some kind of transparency in the city governance. And also we are doing a lot of training for civic leaders who might aspire to become corporators or sometimes MLAs also. Now, keeping that in mind, we also thought we need to start some kind of campus engagement. So hence we are arranging such kind of webinars and panel discussions and talks in various colleges based on topics with respect to good governance and public policy, urban planning, and that's why we chose this topic of union budget and its impact on urban planning, because I think a lot has been said with respect to the impact of the budget in a very generic way. Here we thought we could bring in a little bit more focus about urban planning, because we are all living in urban centers and we need to understand how these economic policies will affect us. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion and hoping to get some really interesting insights from both the speakers, and looking for a very good interaction after that with a lot of Q&As. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Sachin. We now have Shivani, who will be introducing our first speaker for the evening, Dr. Sameer Kagalkar. Over to you, Shivani.
I am happy to take the opportunity to introduce our first speaker for today, Dr. Sameer Kagalkar, an alumnus of Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore's prestigious doctoral program specializing in corporate strategy and policy. Dr. Sameer believes in triple strength leadership model that leaders need to be conversant with three key sectors of our economy: business, society, and the government. His 2 decades of experience spans across all three domains, making him one of very few professionals having this cross-domain experience. He has served in the central government, that is from 2016 to 2018, as an APS to Union Minister for Chemicals and Fertilizers, implementing the best practices of the corporate world and government sector. In specific, he worked closely on the Jan Aushadhi program, helping it scale massively. His other engagements include being the director of MITSOG, headed by T.N. Seshan, with the aim of providing leadership to future political leaders, and chief academic officer at Avagma, an investee firm of Infosys founder Chris Gopalakrishnan. He also consults to various corporates on corporate affairs and public policy. It's an honor to have you here, sir. You can unmute yourself and proceed with the discussion.
Thanks so much for the very generous introduction. And B.PAC and St. Joseph's College, thank you so much for having me here. And a very warm good evening to all attendees here and my fellow panelist, Mr. Pavan Srinath. Broadly, I take the next 20 minutes in terms of discussing what do you think would be the philosophy and the direction the budget is taken. I do not want to get into the nitty-gritties and the hair-splitting of 3.5% increase or 2.5% increase in one particular budget allocation. While that's important, what I intend to sort of set up as a context is trying to understand the kind of situation that we are in, the once in a century kind of a pandemic that we are hit with, and the journey that we need to be taking, and what was envisaged in the last few years, few decades, versus what we want to be in the next few decades going forward, right? I personally believe that budget as an annual exercise has two objectives. One, obviously, it provides you with a snapshot of what the last year was, including the income, the expenditure, deficit, surplus, if any. Right? That's one part of it. Second, as a part of the larger economic journey of the economy of the country. At the end of the day, no budget can be an independent silo in itself. It can't be like, I have a budget which is focused on A this year, and next year completely dump sector A and start working on sector B, and the next year go back to sector C, and so on and so forth. Right? It doesn't happen that way. It shouldn't happen that way. Starting from the early 90s, when I was in my student days, English student days, we get to see that India as a country, India as an economy has come a real long way. That's primarily thanks to the frequent economic reforms, structural reforms that have been undertaken. Most importantly, the kind of a continuity that we have seen in policies across governments. There were days when there was huge amount of political instability, there were huge amount of political policy paralysis, so to speak. But notwithstanding that, there has been a good amount of continuity in the economic thinking and in the economic journey that the country as such has had. In this context, if you were to look at what happened the last year, not that we aren't aware of it, but just a brief 2-minute context on that. Once in a century kind of a pandemic. Pandemics keep happening as we see in the history of the world. But the point is, this is the first time that we as a country would have seen this kind of a pandemic hitting us in a real bad way. The difference between earlier similar situations, let's say a plague in Surat, that we had seen a couple of decades ago versus what happened last year was that it brought the entire economy to a standstill, a complete lockdown. In this context, if one we were to sort of understand what the situation was, Q1 last year showed a 23.9, close to 24% drop in GDP. Understandable given that the entire country was literally in a standstill mode, but for the very, very basic groceries, right? Then you had Q2 that probably looked at about 7.7% drop. That was post stimulus package offered and unlocking that started happening bit by bit, sector by sector. So as we come close to the financial year, we are still a couple of months away, and we should get to know the final results in about 4 or 5 months. The presumption is that the economy as such would have taken a hit of about 7.5% for the last year, which means in one word, while there was a huge big drop in the first quarter and a small drop in the subsequent quarter, the third quarter onwards should have obviously shown a good amount of recovery, a very sharp recovery, so to speak, in terms of the language, a V recovery. In as much as the fall was steep, so was the recovery. And a couple of indicators should broadly give us an indication. It cannot necessarily be an assumption, but backed by some amount of direct and indirect variables. If you look at the high-powered variables that the RBI looks into, out of 48 variables, 36 indicators proved to be very, very positive and on an uptick. Right? Likewise, if you look at the GST collections in the last 4 months subsequent, since the festive season of Navaratri and Deepavali, the economy has seen a big uptick each month, crossing the psychologically important mark of 1 lakh crore GST collections. So much so that the January collections hit a all-time high since GST was introduced to about 1.2, just short of 1.2 lakh crore rupees. So all that this points to two things. One, there was a big hit to the economy, number one, and number two, we are on the recovery mode. That's a very broad statement to be made, right? In this context, let's see what is the budget that intends to do, what is the set of goals and objectives that the budget intends to pursue, right? The foundation, so to speak, if you look at what the budget this year is working on, is basically on the Atmanirbhar Bharat package that was announced last year, first by the vision announcement by the Prime Minister, followed by series of mini budgets by the Finance Minister. Broadly speaking, what does this Atmanirbhar Bharat mean? If you put it in a very, very simple way, I probably use a Chinese proverb. Not that the Chinese proverb is a flavor of the day, but nevertheless, right? So, translated, it says, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, and teach him how to fish, you feed him for life. That's a very broad nuance and philosophy that one needs to be looking at. So when you looked at the stimulus package, it's very evident for a common man, someone who's done a basic 101 economics, that not everything was in the form of grants or aid or freebies or a support directly given to them, right? If you look at the big corporates, they hardly got anything, hardly got anything. If you look at some of the SMEs, they got a fair amount of support in terms of, not in terms of grants, but in terms of credit access. They got access to a better credit, a longer moratorium. Of course, the corporates also had the moratorium part of it, but that apart, nothing else in direct support. The SMEs also got a direct support in terms of some of the EPFO contributions, so on and so forth. If you look at the real hard hit segment, that's the poor people who are literally daily wage earners, for them, a day of non-work means a day of fasting. That was the segment that really required support from the government, and the government went all out to ensure that they were supported. If you look at 3 months, which was initially announced at the rate of 500 rupees per Jandan account headed by women families, after about 20 crore families, 20 crore individuals, sorry, for about 3 months later, extended for about 6 months. You had a 1 cooking gas cylinder being given free of cost, and then you about 5 kgs of rice and 1 kg of dal and jaggery and so on and so forth. The broad idea that it gives us is very clear. Where the need was really high, the government made provisions to ensure that the grant, the support, the money, cash or kind, whatever was ensured. And wherever non-monetary support was required, someone who was fairly strong in it, while it was a big hit to corporates and SMEs as well, it was not as much as a hit as it could have been, let's say, to a daily wage earner. So therefore, that kind of a categorization was there. Not everyone was treated with the same gloves, right? So in this context, the Atmanirbhar Bharat package looked at two things. One, having looked at the kind of a hit that we took as an economy, it reinforced the fact that we as a country need to sort of be really on our own feet, right? What that meant was we had a vision as a country of competing with, let's say, fellow developing country like China or Brazil, with BRICS economy, so to speak, at some point in time. You need to compete with them. It's a healthy competition to have to ensure that you have a better development along with the other quality of life indicators. When I say quality of life indicators, it not only means environment, it means other things like democracy. There's no point in having millions and billions of dollars, let's say like Jack Ma, and one fine day you get to see that you are nowhere or you're nobody. So the balance between the very strong, much required economic growth on one hand, along with the quality of life on the other, means that we need to have a vision, we need to work towards it, right? And pre-pandemic, probably about 2016, 2017, the government of India had made a public commitment to drive the economy towards being a 5 trillion economy by about 2025, and about a 10 trillion economy by about 2030, right? In the backdrop of this pandemic, there were questions, there were doubts. Are we on the track of becoming a 5 trillion economy? Given the hit, what should be the priority, right? The priority should be lives versus livelihood, or to what extent do you support and how do you support? Okay? These were the broad questions that were discussed internally within the party, outside with external experts, with the industry, corporates, academicians, of course, and of course within the government itself, right? Finally, what the government came up with was two things. One, we rest our next step of actions on 5 pillars of Atmanirbhar Bharat. The first one being economy, and the second one being infrastructure. I'll take a minute to sort of explain a bit more. Third one being systems, fourth one demography, and fifth one ensuring that we leverage the supply chain opportunity, right? So what it means is, when you take a look at economy, the first thing was that the survival of the lives, the survival of the individual people is more important than livelihood. That being the case, survival of the people became critical. Second one was revival. So therefore, the first 3 to 6 months was spent literally on ensuring that the basics was provided, whatever the fiscal support required was provision. Second thing was infrastructure. When you're talking of providing or restarting the economy, kicking it up, what it meant was that you need to have a particular goal and therefore do it, versus you can just take money out of the government's pocket, ask the RBI to print more money and put it in the hands of the consumers and say, hey, you have more money now, or whatever money that you had lost, you have it now, go out and spend. right? But one thing one needs to realize is, in terms of uncertainty, very high uncertainty, especially like this, which none of us would have even heard of or seen, the tendency of a human behavior, I'm sure psychologists and behavioral economists would do more of research on this, would be to be as much as possible frugal in our living. One small data let me share. Generally, in the quarter ending June, July, the banks will have about, the banks in the Indian system had about a 1 lakh crore as its deposit space, right? But if you're looking what happened last year, it shot up to close to about 4.5 to 5 lakh crore. What it meant was that it wasn't a lack of money per se at the aggregate level, but the non-intent to spend that money. When you need to save it for a rainy day, you need to ensure that something worse goes wrong, you need to be backed up, right? So that being the case, the government now in hindsight rightly decided that it was not the issue with consumption per se, but stitching up the broken supply chain. Labor had gone back home, companies had either closed down or they had shut shop partially. All that it was required was to ensure that the supply became more normal. So with the normalcy of supply, given that there was always a latent demand, as was seen in the case of the bank deposits as one surrogate variable, you could make out that there could be a back to normalcy action with the supply being there and the demand being slowly triggered. You could get back to a pre-COVID normal economic life probably in about 12 to 18 months time. So in this backdrop was the budget presented this year. So the budget, rightly, in my assessment focused on 4 or 5 core areas, though the 6 pillars have been 6 areas have been mentioned. The FM has looked at 6 areas. One is the health, second being the health, obviously. I mean, given the kind of a pandemic that we are in, the budget for allocation for health had to shoot up. 35,000 crore rupees kept aside for the jabs, and the remaining 2 lakh crore for, I mean, this is a huge improvement from what was in the last year and earlier, to ensure that the healthcare infrastructure, right from the primary mode way up to the state level, was really re-energized. Right? Then it was the infrastructure. The role of infrastructure, I had to sort of loop this back to the previous argument when we spoke of the 5 pillars. Either you pay money to someone to sort of kickstart the economy. I mean, the typical Keynesian economy where you say it's still okay to sort of pay money to people to dig holes in the morning and close it in the evening, so that there is some amount of income generation, therefore spend can be induced. But as we saw just a bit earlier, that wasn't the case really. So what was required is the creation of the long-term assets through your infrastructure mode, and that's where good amount of money going into capex. Even this budget, if you see, 5 years ago the capex was roughly in the range of about 2 lakh crore, but this budget you get to see it is somewhere upward of 5 lakh crore. It signals a very, very strong intent to build an economy, not just now. I mean, by dusting ourselves from getting up and running is of importance in this quarter and beyond. The goal, the vision of ensuring that we become a 5 trillion economy in the next 5 years wasn't let go of. The very fact that you're putting more money in the infrastructure, up from 2 lakh crore to 5 lakh crore, if you look at the railway, for example, being given 1 lakh crore plus, same case with the roads. And in the next 5 years, the intent is to pump in 100 lakh crore over a 5-year period to build the infrastructure. What this means is 2 things very clear. One, your infrastructure is so much ready, be it the roads, be it rails or the airports, your warehouses, cold chain, so on and so forth, that it's like a bamboo shoot. It takes a real long time for you to sort of come out as a green shoot, but once it comes out, shoots out, then there is no holding it back, right? And this is the intent and this is the strategy being used in terms of pump priming the economy. While the money was definitely being pumped into the economy, it was not through fiscal support or in terms of discretionary consumer spend, but to ensure that there's a good amount of capex building, right? And along with the A&B, the Atmanirbhar Bharat package, there was also a thought: never let a crisis go waste. Never let go of an opportunity in terms of leveraging a crisis. So in this crisis, 3 key reforms were brought in. Of course, one we get to see that is currently a hot potato for the political leadership to handle. But the point is abundantly clear. With about 57% of the rural economy, with the Indian population dependent on the rural economy, but generating only about 16 to 17% of the GDP, it was never a sustainable way of building an economy, especially if you're looking at making it a 5 trillion economy in the very next 5 years. What had to happen was transforming the agriculture sector, remove the underemployment and unemployment in the agriculture sector, so that those people are once again reskilled, upskilled, brought into the agro-based industry or services or manufacturing, so that you're able to make a maximum utilization of the assets, be it the physical, be it the financial, or definitely of the human resources. So 3 reforms came hand in hand. One was agricultural resources to make it much more productive and efficient. Second was the labor reforms in terms of making it more meaningful both for the corporates and workers. Let's say, for example, gig economy workers, platform workers, so that a good amount of social security is provided. At the same time, inject a sense of entrepreneurial vision in them. And the third, most important thing, I'm sure all academicians and students present here would agree with this need, that there was a need for a new education policy. And if the country has to sort of move towards being entrepreneurial, being more focused on research and development, there was very little to do except bring about this massive change. And the budget this year focuses rightly on this. For the first time, a 50,000 crore has been kept aside for R&D kind of a initiative. Right? So overall, if you look at it, and the last one, most important one, I should say, is bringing about the rural development and agriculture hand in hand. It's about the second highest amount of 2.7 lakh crore. The first being obviously for the defense purposes. Right? This coupled with the regulatory and policy making activities of minimum government and maximum governance, and especially with respect to the corporate, you see a good amount of quote unquote tax tourism. So whether that's the ground reality or not, the very fact that there has been a good amount of fight between the tax authorities and the corporates, that is something that had to be sort of looked into, and the finance minister rightly so brought in a good amount of changes to ensure, while there is a very strong and a strict regulatory and supervisory mechanism, it needs to be that much more friendly, especially for the people who are honest taxpayers, be it an individual, be it a corporate, right? So in this aspect, if you look at it, how does it pan towards urban planning and housing in specific, right? The very fact that, if I may guess, I may not even, you don't have to even necessarily guess it, but it's very clear if you start inferring, the very clear intent of the government for the next 3 to 5 years is very clear: decongest the big cities. And how do you decongest the big cities? A good amount of economic activities happen there, and be it services, be it manufacturing, so on and so forth. But the only way you can decongest is to ensure there is a balanced growth of cities all across the country. Could be about 100 smart cities. And how do you ensure that happens? They need to be extremely well connected. They need to be physically connected. They need to be connected by air, road, and rails. Most important, in today's world, there is a big advantage of being digitally connected. If you look at the vision of the government in the next 2.5 to 3 years, the government intends to connect all the village panchayats through a very high fiber connectivity, ensure that the digital highway is not missed out by the villages. So what it means is, if you look at a person like Sridhar Vimbo, I just want to give a brief example before I come to my summarization. Corporate leader who strongly believes in what an influencer like him can push the government towards provisioning what is called Pura, what a former President Kalam would speak of, provision of urban facilities to rural areas, amenities to rural areas. Imagine a situation, if you get all the good facilities of Bangalore, while you get the great quality of life, great air, good weather, good quality time with your family and self, why wouldn't anyone be in a small village or a small town? I mean, anyone would love to sort of do that, right? So this is the way where you need to sort of really decongest the cities and plan the development in such a way it's not just about into the 6, 8, 10 top cities, but fairly well balanced and distributed. While it is economically making immense sense, it's also politically meaningful in the sense that you can't have a country that is an 80-20 country. 80% of your economy is run only at 20% of the places and cities, right? So that broadly being the case, my assessment is the huge pumping in of 1 lakh crore on infrastructure through the public-private mode, obviously. The government itself cannot pump in this kind of money on infrastructure, on the housing. Points to one direction that at one level, an affording housing to everyone can be assured of, so long as you're talking of small villages and small towns, given the fact that there is a increase in economic activity out there, making them much more economically prosperous than what they currently are. That's one thing. Second thing, with respect to budget, I would want to make another aspect, another point. While the government was in a dire situation, therefore had a bit of shoot beyond the 9% range of a fiscal deficit last year. I mean, we all know that the Fiscal Responsibility Act mandates that the government restrict itself to a very, very manageable 3% deficit. Given the extraordinary situation, we had no other option but to sort of let go of these situations and move towards a very higher budget fiscal deficit. This year as well, the finance minister has boldly stated that she would go all out to ensure that the social activities, be it health, be it education, be it well-being, is given the top priority, and therefore fiscal deficit to be contained will have to be amended. The act needs to be amended so as to bring about this change for the next 3 to 5 years time, so that you are able to stabilize yourself in the economy and make sure that the country as a whole recovers from this big shock, both health as well as an economic shock. So this in a way ensures that the fiscal deficit is a tool that the government is willing to sort of ensure that the purse strings are not very, very stringent, but as much open as it is required. That brings you to the next question. How do you sort of monetize this deficit? How do you sort of ensure that a good amount of funds come into it? Are you looking at an inflationary economy because of this fiscal deficit, right? So there, once again, kudos to the finance minister. I should definitely say, because of the boldness, thinking in terms of strategic disinvestment of all the non-core PSUs. I mean, it's high time that the government should go in for biting the bullet and call a spade and say the government is not in the business of running business, but in the business of providing good governance, right? Take the case of LIC, extremely well-run company. Today, if LIC were to be going for an IPO, you are able to realize a good amount of value, let's say unlocking about 1 lakh crore plus by giving up a small stake, right? And this is the kind of a step that the government needs to be taking for 2 reasons. One, it would avoid avoidable expenses on salary and running with businesses, so on and so forth. Number one. Number two, it gives the private sector an opportunity to be dominantly present and offer better service to the consumers, right? Today we all have seen, I'm sure some of the youngsters don't have seen here, but people in our 40s and above can definitely compare the situation where we had only one landline given by BSNL, for which we had sort of been in the queue for months and probably years together. I spent for close to 2 years when my father applied for it. Versus today, at your beck and call, you have a credit card in your pocket, you get a card and a phone, right? That's exactly what the economy should be moving. And number three, it gives the government that much more bandwidth to focus on good governance, practice of regulatory and supervisory mechanism rather than running the business, for which one must agree it is not equipped. In sum, if you were to ask me, therefore, what would be the focus of this budget, a summation of this budget's analysis? The budget looked at 2 aspects. One is a continuity, at the same time consolidation. Consolidation of the vision and the small successes and milestone it's been achieved in the last 5-6 years. At the same time, looking at the continuity of the vision of being a 5 trillion economy, taking people along. I mean, as the budget announcement made by Madam FM rightly said, it's an inclusive development for the aspirational India. I mean, people in village are no more content with what they have. They have access to the best in the world, through the digital means. So therefore, it's only natural that they expect good education, good healthcare, good recreational facilities, and this is what is required as a whole, where the country enables the entrepreneurs, unleashing the animal spirits in them, so to speak, to quote Dr. Manmohan Singh, so that the country as a whole not just gets up and walks, but gallops towards a 5 trillion economy. So on this note, I would say this budget is broadly a bold budget, trying to look at infrastructure as the core in terms of pump priming, bringing in money, at the same time taking some bold step towards regulatory reform, bringing in new laws and amendments for a structural reform, and at the same time ensuring that the fiscal deficit is not leading to any inflationary run, right? So broadly, no wonder the census gave a very big thumbs up. So were the corporates and the citizens at large. Of course, some amount of not so happy moments came from the middle class, especially given that there was no tax relief. But if you ask me seriously, it would have been a very naive belief to believe that in these tough situations wherein every pie mattered to the government, and going by the principle of thy need is more than mine, one had sort of bear a small pain for the larger good of the society, of the poor and the needy, and the long-term growth of the country, rather than the small benefits that we would have got. Right. So I close my discussion on this, setting what the broad direction, the philosophy of the budget was, and I look forward to listening to my fellow analysts. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Samir, for your insightful talk. I'm pretty sure everybody enjoyed. And definitely, yes, it is a bold budget. And thank you for highlighting the continuity and consolidation. That's a wonderful takeaway. Up next, I have Shivani, who will be introducing our second speaker for today, Mr. Pavan Srinath. Over to you, Shivani.
Our second speaker for today is Mr. Pavan Srinath, an alumnus of IIT Madras and University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's a public policy researcher from life sciences, a podcaster, communicator, and an educator. He hosts 3 weekly podcasts on public affairs, the Pragati podcast, BIC Talks, and Thale Harate Kannada. He has an academic background in biotechnology, biophysics, and public policy. He has worked for more than 10 years with think tanks, non-profit organizations, and philanthropic foundations. Working in these organizations, he has helped to launch new programs and initiatives, built strategic partnerships, established systems and processes. He also teaches public policy fundamentals, health policy, effective communication, urban governance, data journalism, and government budget analysis. His research and writing interests include science, policy, biotechnology, public health, budgets, and much more. Thank you for joining with us today, sir. Over to you. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, Shivani. Hi, everyone. I'm Pavan, and it's my pleasure to talk to you all about the budget. Now, the budget of India is a fairly unique Indian spectacle and an Indian event that doesn't quite have a natural parallel, even other democratic countries where they pass annual budgets. At its core, budget is an accounting exercise, right? So you sort of look at what's happening in a year. The government is an extremely large set of organizations which need very large sums of money, and so you look at receipts and expenditure. So at one level, it's reasonably mundane. At the next level, what is key is that it gives us a true signal of the intent and the priorities of the government, right? The way our budget system is structured, there is a certain transparency built in where no matter what might be even said in a speech or might be presented in various numbers, overall when you look at the budgets in detail, you get a very clear picture of what the government is thinking of as an expenditure priority. Policy and public policy, of course, goes well beyond expenditure, but it sort of starts there. So we get a sense of where the government is focusing and where it isn't, and that's sort of where we start, right? But if you think about the budget, and even if you've listened to the budget speech, it's only in India that the budget becomes such an avenue for policy announcements as well. So beyond the idea of these revealed preferences that come through, the budget in India becomes the annual biggest spectacle and the biggest event where policy announcements for the year are made. Right? There are, of course, bills in Parliament and other things that are passed at various points in time. So those also occupy the policy calendar, but the budget is the biggest event. Now, this year, for the coming year, the budget is sized at 34.8 lakh crores. Right? So that is an impossible to imagine number, but those are the kinds of numbers that the government of India, or anything that is India size deals with, right? So 34.8 lakh crores translates to about 25,500 rupees per Indian. So this gives you a rough size of how much the government is spending on. Now, if you compare this to our subsequent budgets that will be coming out, that of our state budgets like Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, and others, the Karnataka budget, for example, if you look at it as a per person basis, for per resident in Karnataka, the government of Karnataka spends close to 40,000 rupees, right? So that gives you a sense of the relative uh, spending power that the two governments have. Of course, there's a little bit of double counting involved here because some grants go from the government of India to our state governments, so they don't quite add up. And there's also a little bit that is spent and earned at the local government level. But this gives you a rough sense of how much government spending happens that influences our lives. So while it's very important for us to study the government of India budget, and that's the focus of the discussion today, I would urge everyone who's listening in to also remember to spend as much time looking at what your state budget is like. Because if you look at state subjects and what states spend on the most, you look at health, you look at education, you look at everything that has been affected by the pandemic, from infrastructure to our cities and more, they're all state subjects, and states have a predominant spending role when it comes to states. So what we see is that um, like take health for example, something that the government of India, especially this last year, has spent quite a lot on to meet the extremely challenging demands of the pandemic year. But overall, if you see, in a state like Karnataka, if there are 100 rupees spent overall by governments on health, about 70 of those rupees are spent by the state government. uh, uh, Across the country, the number might be something like 65-35. And if you look at overall expenditure, you could say that the government of India spends maybe about 45% of the overall government spending, and the remaining 55% or so comes from the states, right? So and while the budget gets a month of coverage in the run up, perhaps a month of coverage once the budget has been announced and all the documents are available online for anyone to read and understand and analyze, state budgets barely get coverage for a day, if even that. Sometimes newspaper will not even devote a full edition, but maybe 2 pages, and then we are done. Right? So I just want to say that when we're looking at the government of India spend, we're looking at the tip of an iceberg, and we have to look at what happens thereafter. Coming to the government of India budget, it's like Dr. Sami before me, who laid out the context of this budget. This was unprecedented, right? By any stretch of imagination. I think India has seen contractions only 3 times since independence, nothing of this scale since a very long time ago. So, under these extraordinary circumstances, we have seen expenditure rise, which was necessary and maintained at a new level. Right. So, one of the big governing ideologies that governed government spending between, say, 2003 and now was a very tight fiscal control. Right. So you had a fiscal deficit, and it was actually the NDA 1.0 under Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee that we had the fiscal responsibility act that was brought into place to rein in government spending so that we don't spend beyond our means. Because every time we borrow, what we are actually doing is we are borrowing from the future, right? So if we borrow more today, next year's budget will have a much greater proportion which has to be used for interest and capital repayments. So we are borrowing from our own future. And so that is something that had been restrained even through extraordinary circumstances, especially by consecutive NDA governments as well, and for a while the UPA government. But in the middle, our fiscal deficit had gone up, and so when we actually entered this pandemic, India did have a bit of a fiscal challenge on its hand. India already had a big banking crisis that has been unfolding since about 2012 or even earlier. And on top of this, we are in a place where we've made some progress on various social factors over the last decade. But what we have seen since the pandemic is that we have lost anywhere between 2 and 5 and 10 years on several indicators. It doesn't mean that we need 2 or 5 or 10 years to make back the what we have lost, but it gives us a sense of the size. Right? So what we know is that we might have lost about 2 years worth of our economic output, that is the GDP, and we might need time. And if we grow faster, of course, we might be able to erase the overall impact of the pandemic on India's economy, but that's a bigger challenge. So you have that, but at the same time, you have, if you look at, say, um, the percentage of people who were in salaried jobs, we have gone back since before the pandemic to 2011 2012 levels, right? So many more people have become daily wage earners. Many daily wage earners during the extent of the lockdown, when it was intense, became self-employed or worked in farming, right? And you have a slow return, a steady return back to daily wage earning, and but the salaried jobs take a little longer, right? So we have that much of a hit there. While economic recovery, especially private sector recovery, has been strong, at least as it's seen by the financial markets and the Sensex, the recovery has not been uniform. Right, larger companies, um, more formal large companies were those which could withstand the pressures of this pandemic and this lockdown and the economic crisis that struck us a little bit better. Smaller firms were hit harder. The informal sector, honestly, it is still too early to tell. We need to find out more about in all the ways that India's informal economy has been hit, right? And what that means for overall economic activity, poverty levels in the country, and more. So it was unprecedented times, and yes, the government rightly increased the fiscal deficit to a higher number so that we could spend where it was necessary, starting with health this year and on infrastructure and more things from now. But if you look at the budget, let's look at the revenue side. It's interesting what happened in the pandemic year with the loss of economic growth, right? We had an economic contraction. In spite of that, if you look at the tax revenues that the government received, they did not fall too greatly, right? Income tax, including corporate income tax, maybe fell by about 1-2%. The 1 to 2% of GDP. The greater with GST, we knew that even before the pandemic had even reared its head, the GST projections in last year's budget were quite optimistic, and that we may not be able to meet them. So once you count that, I think the GST collections have also been great. I think the bigger challenge has been the lack that the government gets in terms of its non-tax resources, right? So these could be dividends that the government receives from all the public sector companies that it owns. These could be dividends coming in from banks, right? So a lot of that expenditure went down. And the one challenge that the governments have faced for quite a long time, strategic disinvestment at a large scale and in a continuous manner, continued to be a challenge this year, right? And that's in spite of the Sensex and the markets, financial markets, doing quite well over the last 4 to 6 months. So against a target of about 2 lakh crores, only about 30,000 crores are estimated that the government will receive in this financial year from disinvestment. So, and again, the next year's target has been set at 1.75 lakh crores, right? So that gives us a bit of a concern and a question mark on whether the government will be able to do disinvestment at the rate and the pace and with the complexity necessary in order to achieve these uh, significant fiscal targets, right? So it is an opportunity nevertheless, and it's very important that signaling is done. So a big part of the budget and the speech is storytelling, right? It is important for a government to tell the story of how it is going to tackle the challenges that are ahead of us, and the budget is an important way in which this story is told, right? So here so we are seeing this kind of expenditure, and we are seeing this kind of revenue challenges, and we are seeing, of course, a massive increase in the loans that the government is taking to make up for any shortfalls so that we can spend enough. And when you look at the budget side, as Dr. Samir also pointed out, the big the big positive, the biggest takeaway from this budget is that we have 5.54 lakh crores allocated towards capital expenditure. This is the highest, I think, in about 14 years. This is badly needed. and now we have to hold our government to account to ensure that this much of capital expenditure is spent. Because think about it, capital expenditure is a little different from revenue expenditure. In a sense, it is optional, right? So if you have a staff of employees and you have to pay their salaries, you have to pay their salaries. That's a committed liability on the government's part. If you're renting buildings, then the maintenance of the building is a committed expenditure on a government's part. Whereas building a new kilometer of road, building a school, building, doing any kind of capital investment and acquisition of technology or equipment or more, it can always be delayed, right? So often when governments, be it state governments or national governments, feel a fiscal squeeze, there is a chance that the capital expenditure comes down. One, it is definitely to be admired that even through the pandemic, the capital expenditure for this year was not lowered. I mean, it only dropped by a little in the revised estimate. So kudos on that. And this high number is a good. Uh, I mean, if we can achieve even 90% of this, I think we'll be in a good place, right? But it puts significant challenges on our implementation infrastructure, just like the implementation infrastructure needed for that kind of strategic disinvestment is significant, right? You need the right kind of capacity at right levels of government to achieve the kind of outcomes that have been declared. So that is something that we'll have to watch for, but it's definitely a very positive development. When it comes to things other than capital expenditure, I must say that while there is an allocation for the much needed COVID-19 vaccine of about 35,000 crores, and the finance minister is also on the record saying that if more monies are needed, they will be appropriated over the coming year. This is a welcome development, but if you look at overall health expenditure, social sector expenditure, and various other numbers, we are roughly at the same levels that we were in 2019-20. The fiscal year before the pandemic. So in that sense, it's good that we are able to at least think about spending that much money, but we have had some amount of inflation since then, and the quantum of money needed might be much more. And here I'm looking forward to more policy ideas from the government after the budget, because I have not yet sufficiently seen how a new social security system can be imagined that can help a lot more Indians, right? There are many who have suffered, many who have also received aid from the government, but we can always do more and better. And I think we need fresh ideas beyond the conventional to rethink social security. Even on health insurance and healthcare, what are we doing that is radically different from before? Are we making the kind of public health investments that are necessary so that private cost of healthcare becomes lesser, because we have fixed the problem much earlier in the problem chain? And here I would say that uh, I think the government has still had the challenge of doing firefighting, necessary firefighting, but we need to see more ideas come through. The kind of ideas that exist on the infrastructure side, I'd say they are much stronger, and I'm hoping to see more articulation, right? And on all these social terms as well, we have taken a big hit, right? So there are many students who, of course, had to stay home. If there were government school students or private school students, they had to stay home, and we don't know the impact this might have on, say, girl children coming back to school once the pandemic is over. There might be financial constraints on the parents. There might be other challenges, and we've taken quite a while, and the country has invested significant resources on helping improve sort of gender participation at schooling level and then later at college level and so on. So it's important that some of this actually might need some pump priming, right? So you might need to do like a social mobilization drive to get people back to school, get people back to taking routine health checks and taking care of non-COVID and non-infectious diseases related health challenges, which are significant in our country. So I would want to see more articulation even beyond this budget on how we can get there in a better manner. Right now, the allocations are good, but they're not a dramatic increase over the past. So we'll have to wait and see. So I don't want to go on for too much longer. I want to say that one thing to me, this might be a technical thing that only a policy analyst or a budget analyst might be interested in. One thing that I'm very happy with this budget is that we can finally get to a place of higher transparency where this budget has restored a certain amount of faith in the government's numbers that it puts out every year. One of the challenges over the last 2-3 years was that there were a few items of expenditure that were considered below the budget line. So the idea was that, for example, the government had to pay arrears to the Food Corporation of India, which goes out and buys wheat and rice at MSP prices from farmers, right? But instead, the government had instructed the Food Corporation of India to take a loan from the National Small Savings Fund. So technically, on the budget, the expenditure looked much lower, but the real expenditure or the liability to the government was always higher. So this has been made much more transparent. A part of the reason why we are seeing such a large fiscal deficit for this financial year is that a lot of these um, expenditures that were off the budget books have been brought on the budget books. This has been, again, a good use of a crisis in sort of putting these things above the line, resetting the fiscal um, uh, regulations that are necessary, that govern how much the government can borrow and spend. And so because they have been cleaned up, we can actually trust that next year we can actually target 6.5% of fiscal deficit. And again, fiscal deficit might feel like the most boring terms in a time like this, when we want to when we need to spend and build infrastructure and build a better India, right? And we need to spend what is necessary for it, but it will constrain us. And so I think by and large, the decisions taken have been fairly wise. We'll, of course, but the challenge in the government has always been, how do we get from announcement to execution to implementation? And I think it's our duty as citizens, as active citizens, to keep an eye on that over the coming year, so that we know what to expect from the government at the end of the year, and perhaps what new we ought to ask for the year after. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pavan, for the insightful talk. Thank you for highlighting India-sized budgets, as well as talking about both state budgets and our national budgets. And we now have a question answer session, and Neha and Sarah will take over. So over to you, Neha and Sarah. You can unmute.
Thank you, Varuna. Can you hear me?
Yes, you are audible.
Thank you. So these are the questions posed by our audience. The first question goes to Dr. Samir Kagalkar and goes as, what are your views on the need to introduce agriculture income tax?
It's an absolutely important and relevant question. I mean, it might sound like a cliche speaking of this as a relevant and important question, but at some point in time, we as a country need to sort of really look at where the taxes should come from, right? There are poor salaried guys, there are well-to-do salaried guys, there are extremely rich salaried guys, right? There are people who draw 10,000 rupees a month, there are people who draw a lakh a month, there are people who draw 10 lakhs a month, and of course you have people who draw even a crore a month. Likewise, you have farmers who are like very, very poor farmers, decently well-to-do farmers, and extremely well-to-do farmers. So there is a need in terms of both equity, at the same time ensure that efficient allocation of resources happen. As to how do we look into it, I'm not saying we have to do it today or tomorrow, but at some point in time, that has to be the destination. Anyone who earns a living, when you're talking of bringing in GST to a beauty parlor, a beautician who's going to spend her time is going to pay a GST. There is absolutely no reason why anyone else should not be paying, right? You have a delivery boy delivering something and paying a GST on this. Each and every activity is being brought under the ambit of law, ambit of tax, direct or indirect, right? So that being the case, there is a need both in terms, as I said, both equity as well as the resource mobilization purposes. To what extent will the political leadership and the vested interest, most important, look at this as we getting to see, as we talk, we get to see the hot potato of farm sector reforms, wherein even an openly, seemingly helpful stuff is being vehemently opposed for a wide variety of reasons. But that said, challenges are bound to be there, and as a nation, we need to sort of really ask ourselves if we need to sort of move in a direction which is not only towards prosperity, but also at the same time being fair to every citizen in his or her own way.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is to Mr. Pawan Srinath. What is the influence of the current budget on the education sector, considering the pandemic, digital divide, and higher pandemic rates?
Thank you so much for the question. Before we think about the budget on this count on education, one thing I think we should think about is what happened with the disruption in education. Right now, of course, there were a lot of efforts made to provide digital education for a large number of people, students in government and private schools across the country. But we do know that in spite of the efforts made, there were still many students who, there might be one family and one phone. If there are two children, maybe one child doesn't get access to a phone, or there might be network issues and so on. So actually, when we're thinking of the infrastructure budget and so on, to me, the 5G internet and having high quality internet across the country and high quality telecom network across the country is actually a very important thing for our education sector, for our employment sector, for pretty much it has teledensity has always had an overwhelming positive effect on the kind of economic activity and development that can take place. So that's my overall idea. But when it comes to education, unfortunately, even if you have the best of technology available, studies that are coming through from the Nordic countries, from foreign countries, from various really high quality, high expenditure online teaching programs, I've found that even the best programs do not go more than 60 or 70% in terms of delivering learning outcomes compared to classroom education, right? So the idea of being in a physical class, learning from your next door neighbor, next desk neighbor, that peer group and your physical learning, humans are still in a state of evolution where that is how we learn best, right? We get tactile feedback, we touch things, we write things down on paper, not make keyboard strokes, and so those things make a difference. So I think this is not a challenge we can get away from. The budget, like I said, even on the education budget, there's been a small increase over the 2019-20 numbers, and even maintaining that is difficult given the kind of economic state that we are in. So I would say we're doing well, but I think more than spending, it's the other social things that we'll need to get place so that people come back to school at the right time.
Thank you, sir. The next question is to Dr. Samir. Given that the government has been borrowing for the purpose of consumption expenditure, and this year they are more fiscally constrained due to the COVID and pandemic, what will the next few years look like in terms of our public finances, and will it improve?
The focus on the public finances working very closely with the private sector. I mean, if this is something that we don't understand, it's going to be very tough for any government leader to be pushing the government, right? I'll give you a small instance. In the last year, when there was an opportunity, a big ticket opportunity on the supply chain infrastructure creation front. You had the global supply chain being disrupted because China being viewed with a bit of distrust by most of the manufacturing countries. So they started following the policy of China plus one. So they probably, some of them moved to Philippines, some of them moved to Malaysia, some of them to Indonesia and to India as well. You had a good regulatory policy that not only allowed them, welcomed them, but structured the engagement in such a way that they would probably bring in more and more amount of money. And that, for example, if you look at the PLI, production linked incentive, generally the incentive that you would want to give someone would be, okay, we'll give you a land for free, we'll give you a startup subsidy where the first 25% of the cost would be borne by the government, so on and so forth. Versus this was a completely different thing where it was completely based on outcomes. For example, your top line is 100 crores, you get, let's say, 4 to 6%, depending on which particular segment that you are in. Take it for our ease of conversation about 5%. you get 5% as subsidy of your top line. If you're doing 150 crores, you probably get 7.5 crores. If you do 200 crores, you get 10 crores, right? So the point was very clear. The more you produce, the more benefit you're going to get. What does that mean? I mean, so that means that with a very little investment, so to speak, from the government, you are encouraging private investment into the country and also giving them a carrot if they do well. And how will they do well? How will they scale up this much? Only if they can not only cater to India, but also cater to the worldwide audience, right? So you're able to export it in a big way. So this probably becomes the strategy for the future. All the more considering the fact that if you look at the economies, a lot of the Western economies, they are already turning into a negative interest rate regimes, right? So there are cases wherein you hardly have any interest rate if you put your funds in the bank. So where will this 18 trillion funds go, right? They need an economy which is thriving, which is booming, and where there's a fairly good regulatory reforms happening. Most importantly, you get returns for the investment. And India is one such opportunity. All that it requires is an imaginative, creative way of engaging with them, like the PLI thing. So they get more and more confirmation. For example, Samsung has already made a commitment of billions of dollars of investment over the next 5 years, committing to produce billions worth of mobiles for export as well. So this will improve the investment scenario. It will generate a good amount of employment, income, taxes for the government as well, and for the investor firm, a good amount of tax benefit, subsidy in the form of subsidy, tied up to the production. So in a way, this is a win-win situation for the entire country, the government, and the investor. So answering your question once again in a nutshell, where will the finances come from? Where the public policy finances headed to? It's working very closely with the private sector, the private investors, be it domestic or abroad.
Thank you, sir. The next question is to Mr. Pawan Srinath, and go there. Why is there less budget in defense during this conflict between the Chinese and the Indian? The Chinese government sanctions are 5 times more than the Indian government.
Thank you for the question. So India's defense budget has many constraints, right? So now, again, think about how much we are already spending this fiscal year and how much of a fiscal deficit we have, how much we are borrowing. So, and how much of that borrowing is necessary for infrastructure, which gives us medium to longer term growth in the country towards certain immediate needs like social safety and social security versus something like defense, right? And this is a very hard call to make. So, one, I don't have a very strong opinion on whether the defense budget should have been significantly higher or not, right? Uh, but what concerns me is the quality of the defense budget. If you look at it, last year before the pandemic, the budget estimate for defense pensions alone was over 1 lakh crore rupees. Right, so that is a committed liability. It was a commitment made by the government to do one rank, one pension, which had a significant fiscal cost to it as well, to provide the necessary pension for retiring soldiers and military personnel. And so that is now a commitment, right? And our Indian Army is an immensely large army, and if you look at, China might have a much bigger defense budget, but the Chinese army has actually been downsizing over the last several years because they thought that for 21st century modes of fighting, maybe you don't need as many people, but the same people with better training, different equipment, etc. Right, so that is the larger context. So within this now, the question is, how can we contain the cost of this crisis in a meaningful manner? And I think it is very clear and evident that for India, at its fiscal, the place that it's in, for China as well, continued and escalated conflict is not a good thing, right? And the pandemic and the fiscal challenges only make that more real. So an optimistic way to look at it would be that nobody can afford an expensive war right now, so perhaps that will influence some of the diplomacy that takes place. The pessimistic view would be that if worst comes to worst, we will be in a difficult place financially, and that is the reality. I mean, like, post a pandemic, post an economic crisis like this is always the worst time for violent conflict at any border. And so I would say that that will have to be factored into any strategic decisions that are taken by the political and the military leadership in the country.
Just to add to one point here, as rightly pointed out by Pavan, there are certain times when with the existing resources there could be much more efficiency produced. We are all economists, we understand the value of efficiency, right? Push your production, what do you call it? PPF, right? Production possibility frontier, right? With the given existing resources, there are two things that's also complementing it. The kind of a leadership that the country gives, the political leadership that the country gives to the armed forces, with the existing constraints, sort of take on the enemy, right? I mean, if you have been seeing the last few, I would say probably years, 3 years, 4 years, the kind of aggressive response being meted out with the same resources, with the same fighting equipment and the kind of men and material that we have, brings in some sort of a deterrence. I would want to sort of bring this tied up to the deterrence aspect, right? So one thing is, as we all know, and it's a must that we need to really upgrade ourselves, our armed forces, both in terms of men, technology, and equipment. But at the same time, what is, as you rightly put on the optimistic front, how do you stop a war or an escalation of a war? There needs to be some deterrence, right? And that deterrence is provided by the kind of a response that you generally show. So I think to that extent, as it stands today, seems to be a fair upper hand on the deterrence part of it, given that there can be an expectation of a very strong response. But in the medium term to long term, undoubtedly there needs to be an upgradation of equipment, of technology, of men, and that will call for a huge amount of resources. Hope the government looks into it.
Thank you, Dr. Samir. Thank you, Mr. Pavan. Dr. Samir, there's one more question for you. With reference to the latent demand, should this budget also have focused on integration of numerous central schemes so as to expand the investment expenditure?
I mean, I think someone would have already messaged this to Madam Finance Minister. The central government is already looking into revising and reforming various central government schemes so as to dovetail them into more meaningful and lesser number of categories. Instead of having 100 different programs and schemes, why don't you sort of make them into 30 schemes so that you're able to look at a sector more holistically and address it. Similar exercises incidentally is being carried out in the Karnataka government as well, as we see. So I think that's a good point, and thanks to whosoever has raised it now and earlier to the finance minister as well.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Pavan Srinath, you have one more question. Will India really achieve the goal of Atmanirbhar Bharat or the policy and the aim of self-reliant India, a vision envisaged by our Honorable Prime Minister?
Thank you so much for this question. I think Atmanirbharta is a word that has many different meanings and means many different things to many different people, right? So one of the worst meanings it could have, and that is certainly not one that I imagine that many share, is that it is an old thinking of self-reliance where you make a country, an economy autarkic, right? Largely dependent internally for most of its resources and its needs, be it labor or capital or technology. Right. So that is a very old idea. We had the idea of import substitution back in the day, and it's something that we have finally gotten out of and become a country which, honestly, in the last 30 years, if you see exports, both software exports and goods exports, have been a significant contributor to Indian economic growth. Right. So to me, the correct way to look at Atmanirbharta would be the idea of what are the things that India can do to strengthen its comparative advantage in certain key areas, and what can it do to build new comparative advantages in various parts of its country, geography, and its economy, right? So this, to me, it's not about import versus export. And there is a concern because, I mean, funds are tight and you have to pull funds from somewhere. And the two places that the government is taxing in a bigger way are customs, that is import duties, and on petrol and diesel, right? And that was the call that was taken. It's tough to say which is the correct and which is the wrong call. But having taken that call, we should not go back to that era, right, where we were thinking of import substitution. But I hope that we won't go anywhere near there. So when we think about developing new comparative advantages, can India's vaccine industry, can India's biotech industry start playing a much larger global role post this pandemic, right? Can we use our biotech talent pool, our startup ecosystem that's among the best in the world, even if still much smaller than the likes of the biotech sector in the United States? Like, can we build more things, right? So to me, one of the biggest revolutions in the last 30 years has been the IT revolution in terms of sheer number of high quality job creation and the amount it has influenced even urban growth and development. So can we, after this pandemic, be it in biotech, be it in healthcare, be it in pretty much any sector, be it in core industry, heavy machinery, for example, can we create those comparative advantages? And that goes well beyond the budget, right? That goes into uh, cleaning up our banking system, allowing credit flow to increase much more greatly, to build stronger linkages between the financial markets and the real economy, do an incredible amount of job creation that is necessary. There are honestly far too many people who are now dependent on agriculture in the country, right? I mean, India leapfrogged it's the traditional development model of agriculture, industry, services. We sort of leapfrog the industry, and we now need that industry to develop in a much larger way if we want to be able to absorb everyone who is graduating from the country, and ensure that they have a livelihood of dignity. And I would say, so if there is a greater focus happening on building serious competence and excellence in various spheres, I'm all for it. And we'll have to see how that happens. We are as much responsible for it as much as the government.
Absolutely well said, Pavan. This sense of fear or wrong reading of what Atmanirbharta can be, I mean, that's definitely a concern, and you rightly pointed out, this is definitely not an autarky. Just to give two instances, as one, as you rightly put, taking the case of PPE kits and ventilators, right? At the start of the lockdown last year, we hardly had any PPE kit production worth the name. We would import almost our entire requirement. And in about 3.5 to 4 months' time, we started producing more than 4.5 lakh PPE kits per day, which is good enough for not just ourselves, but they started exporting it to other countries at a fairly good competitive price so that they also benefited. And as you rightly put, the same case with the vaccination. Not only were we able to sort of find a vaccination for ourselves, but also send across to 10 different countries who very, very generously sort of stand firm with the government as such, with the country as such, building a strong relationship. On the other hand, as you rightly pointed out, there is a paucity of funds internally. We need to look out, and the biggest example that comes to our mind is that of Reliance. In the last 1 year, I mean, less than 6 months, they were able to generate more than 1 lakh crore worth of funds coming into them in terms of their investment, as a part of taking up stake in Geo. So we had more than 1 lakh crore rupees coming into the country. So the intent is very clear. We need to build up our comparative advantages. We need to become stronger and lead towards a prosperous world without being a burden on anyone else as such. Because at the end of the day, no one, be it any other country or organization like the UN, would want to carry the burden of any country, let alone a big country like India, on their shoulders for too long. We need to be on our own for our own good and for the good of the country, for the world as well. Thanks so much for adding that.
I'd like to thank both our speakers for answering our questions with so much interest and patience. That's all with the questions. Verona, over to you.
Thank you, Neha, and thank you, Dr. Sameer and Mr. Pavan. Now I invite Sanjana Chopra to deliver her vote of thanks.
Thank you, Verona. On the behalf of the Department of Economics of St. Joseph's College, Bangalore, I'd like to extend my gratitude to the Bangalore Political Action Committee, not just for collaborating with us in the organization of the webinar, but also for taking a proactive role in Bangalore's governance and inspiring us to do the same. I'd also like to thank our speakers, Dr. Sameer Kagalkar, Mr. Pavan Srinath, for coming on this platform and sharing their invaluable knowledge with our students and our professors. I would like to extend our immense gratitude to our principal, Father Dr. Victor Lobo SG, the rector, the registrar, Dr. Melvin Colasso, and all the vice principals, the management of St. Joseph's College, members of the organizing committee and technical committee for making it possible for us to have this webinar. Lastly, I'd like to thank all our participants of the webinar for turning up in force and demonstrating the interest in such a crucial topic, and for making this webinar a success.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to everyone, and thank you so much for listening.
Thanks so much.
You,
Appreciate the platform.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Sanjana. So kindly note, the feedback forms will be available in the chat box. The certificates will be sent within a week. And I thank everyone who was a part of this webinar this evening. I hope you all had a great time. And I'd like to thank our speakers again, Dr. Sameer, Mr. Pavan. It was a wonderful session. And thank you so much. I request the faculty as well as the organizing committee to kindly stay back. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.